Hi, so this is the video lecture on gender inequality. Now, the first item of business in our discussion of gender is to learn the difference between sex and gender. The two are often used interchangeably in mainstream society, but sociologists think it important to distinguish between the two. So the term sex refers to the biological identity of an individual, or in other words, whether they're male or female, whereas gender is what society considers to be appropriate masculine and feminine traits, behaviors, occupations, and interactions. So essentially, sex is biological, while gender is socially constructed. Women are thought to be more passive, more emotional, more nurturing, while men are more aggressive and more rational. Now, gender is important because it not only influences our identities, but it also influences our interactions. Now, this is not to imply that there aren't certain aspects of gender that may be biological, but research generally indicates that the social environment greatly influences the characteristics we associate with masculinity and femininity. So one point to consider here is, once again, how gender varies across culture. So you can consider the landmark study Margaret Mead performed on different cultures in New Guinea. In one tribe, she found that both men and women exhibited what we classify as feminine traits. In another, she found that men and women exhibited what we classify as masculine traits. And in the third, the women exhibited what we consider masculine behaviors, and the men exhibited feminine traits. Now, this study helps us understand that gender and the identities we associate with gender isn't as closely related to nature as some may think it to be. And gender can also vary within any given culture. When you think about what was the appropriate behavior for men and women 100 years ago, that tends to be significantly different than what we consider to be appropriate masculine and feminine behavior today. Now, we internalize our gendered identities, behaviors, and values through the process of socialization. And when you think about it, there's a lot of effort that goes into creating gender. From the moment we're conceived, really, people want to start talking about the sex of the baby or the gender of the baby. They want to start constructing that gender based on the sex classification. As I mentioned in the introductory video at the beginning of this semester, I am currently expecting, and so I wasn't really surprised that I would be frequently confronted with the question of what is it about the baby, right? And when people ask what is it, they're not asking like what species it is, rather they're asking, is it a boy or a girl? Now, what I was surprised by, what I have been surprised by, is the degree to which I wanted to know the answer to this question. And it surprised me that I was so curious about it, because I have long believed that gender is socially constructed. I've long held the belief that sex and gender are not as interconnected as we may think them to be. So why is it that knowing the sex of my baby made me somehow feel like I would know more about it? Now, here's kind of the thing that the conclusion that I've come to after reflecting on why it was so important for me to know the sex of our child. And it's because even though it's socially constructed, gender is a major component of our identities. And so we know the sex of our child. She is female. And you know, it gets a little bit sticky when you talk about sex and gender and how the two aren't necessarily always related to one another. But what David and I have decided is that we will be observant of our child's gender development, and not assume that just because she's a female, she'll be a girl. Another point to consider here in terms of gender is that it's strictly policed in our society, especially for men. And so what I mean by that is that if somebody deviates from these cultural expectations of femininity or masculinity, they often receive some resistance from others in society, or some negative sanctions, going back to a term we learned when we discussed culture in Unit 2. Now, while women can often take on more masculine qualities without a whole lot of backlash, although there are certainly exceptions to this, men are generally ostracized for exhibiting more feminine traits. And to a sociologist, this has to do with how we value masculinity and femininity in society. Lastly, keep in mind that gender not only affects our identities and our interactions, but our institutions as well. There are patterns of behavior that fall along gendered lines. The labor market is a really great example of this. We have certain jobs that are associated with men and dominated by men, and then we have other jobs that are associated with and dominated by women, and you can probably think of what those are. Sports, very similar, right? We have segregation by sex or gender in our professional sports, education, even in families. We see kind of patterned behaviors along gendered lines. Now, we see inequality between men and women in our society in a variety of ways. Men tend to hold more positions of power. They receive more money for the same job that women do, even with the same levels of education and the same experience. They are represented more in our entertainment industry. And so we have to consider what are the hegemonic explanations for these differences. How does mainstream society make sense of it? Well, it largely centers on the idea that these differences are natural, that the differences between men and women are biologically derived and are thus natural. This largely dismisses the idea that gender is socially constructed and that social construction might have something to do with inequality. In contrast, sociologists focus on the patriarchal nature of society to explain the inequalities that we see. This is the idea that society is male-dominated, male-centered, and male-identified, all of which are described in more detail in the assigned handout, so I'm not going to go over them now. That's it. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please let me know. Have a great day.